Today on episode 181 of the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, we speak to culture expert Fiona Robertson, and she's going to tell you how you can make these couple minor changes to change your culture and change your results. That's right, it's all about culture and results today. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it. Welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, a weekly podcast series dedicated to helping you hit peak performance across the three domains of leadership. Those being leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization. This podcast couples my 20 years of military experience as a senior Canadian Army officer with world-class guests to bring you the most complete podcast of leadership going. And for more, feel free to check out our website at movingforwardleadership.com. And with that, let's get to the show. Hey leaders, how are you doing today? As you're listening to this podcast, how are you doing? Check in with me. Say, hey Scott, doing great. Hey Scott, struggling. Hey Scott, checking in on you. Whatever. I'm just wondering how you're doing. Anyway, let's get to business, shall we? So, welcome to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. If it's your first time listening, thanks for coming out. It's great to have all the new listeners out there. The show, the ecosystem has just been outstanding and explosive lately. I can't believe the reach that this is getting. It blows my mind every day. But you know what? It just shows the quality product that comes out of here. And speaking of quality product, let's talk about today's product, shall we? In talking about changing your culture, changing your results, right? As leaders, our organizations thrive on the culture we establish. We have a great culture. We have great results. We have a crap culture. Guess what? You're going to get crap results. One way or another, your results are going to be garbage. And that's what we're tackling today. So with that, we brought in Fiona Robertson. She is an expert in organizational culture, leadership, teamwork, and has an MBA from London Business School. She's also a graduate from the Australian Institute of Company Directors and the Institute of Executive Coaching and Leadership. Once upon a time, she was the head of culture at the National Australia Bank, worked in dozens blue chip corporates at all kinds of level and government within Australia. Coached senior executives, big, small, you name it. She's done it. And she's also worked with the Australian Graduate School of Management, the ANZ Bank, the NCR, Monash College, and it just keeps going. Now Fiona is here talking with us on this super important topic. And you know me, if you've been following the show for any amount of time, I love talking about culture because it's just so important. It literally makes or breaks your organization. So what do we talk about in the show today? We talk about how culture and belonging will help leaders achieve peak performance, how to drive cultural change and using belonging principles, how to create a disconnect between cultural expectations and actions, how leaders can engage their people to drive cultural change, and enable subordinates to bring forward ideas, and much more. I'm telling you, Fiona is a rock star. It was super amazing having her, especially with all the experience she's got. And if you want to drive your culture more, then come check me out at movingforwardleadership.com. And in particular, come check out the coaching section, because sometimes, you know what? We just need another set of eyes on our problems, right? And sometimes we just need someone to bounce those ideas off of to really think of it. And that's where I come in. That's one of the services I provide here at Moving Forward Leadership is coaching. So feel free to go to movingforwardleadership.com, movingforwardleadership.com/coaching, and check out, and drop me a line. If you think I can help, I'll be more than happy to have a quick chat with you and see how we can get you pointed in the right direction. But nonetheless, that's enough for me. So why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Fiona Robertson about how you can change your culture, change your results. Fiona, welcome to the show. So great to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's great to be here.
So let's dive in, shall we? We are discussing your book, your first book that I do recall, right?
Correct.
Let's dive in. Let's go hard. Let's go fast. So how is this, and the ideas behind the book and in the book going to help leaders, help them hit their peak performance when it comes to the organization and the organizational culture?
Yeah, great question. So pretty much every leader that I ever talk to will tell me enthusiastically how important culture is. They never argue with this point. Yes, it's very important. They'll often use that phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. In my experience, though, very few genuinely know what the word culture actually is. They know it's, the way we do things around here, all those kinds of, slightly esoteric concepts, but they find it really hard to pinpoint exactly what the thing is, and therefore how to identify what it is now, how to figure out what they want it to be, and how to get from A to B. So what I do in the book is just go back through some of the sort of evolution of the human species and talk about the fact that our brains have essentially not changed for about 80,000 years. And back then, we had to be a member of a group in order to survive. So good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we're all taught at school, says that food, water, and shelter is the most basic need of a human being. All the latest neuroscience is telling us that that's actually wrong, and that the most basic need of a human being is to belong in a group. And so we have this brain in our heads that believes that if we don't belong, we will die. And then that just means that when we join a new group, we have evolutionary superpowers that allow us to identify what the successful behavior is in that group that we've joined. And whether we know it or not, we slowly start to adopt that behavior as our own. So that's why I define culture as the rules of belonging in a group. And I think once you've defined it that way, suddenly leaders can go, that thing that we've always been talking about, this culture word, if I now know it's the rules of belonging, I can actually start to see what those rules might be and ask myself the question, is the behavior that we want to encourage more of behavior that earns belonging in my team? What earns belonging in my team? What loses belonging in my team? And start to actually see what they're in. So I think of it a bit like, if you're living in the Matrix, and you don't know you're living in the Matrix, then you don't see anything because you don't know there is anything to see. But as soon as you come across this idea that culture is the rules of belonging, then you kind of start to see it everywhere. And once you've seen it, then you can make sensible decisions about it, figure out where you want it to be, and start moving from A to B.
Love it. That's lots of good areas that where we could segue. But it's very interesting for me personally, because this is my side hustle. I do this on the side. We're recording this on a Tuesday evening, and I just finished up a long day's work as a senior Canadian Army officer. And one of the things that you mentioned is interesting to me, because you mentioned how we bring someone into the organization. So immediately for me, I go back to what? Boot camp. And what do we do at boot camp? We literally shave people's heads, take away all their clothes, give them other clothes, of course, to wear, i.e. a uniform, and that's all you get to wear. And we indoctrinate people into our organizational culture that way. And it's obviously not every company out there is going to go through the same type of rigmarole as what we do in Canadian Army, but still, it's all linked. So it makes so much sense when you break that down and frame it in that way. And the final part is,
You go.
Yeah,
Sorry,
the final interesting part is that, that whole need of belonging and it being the basic human need. And I agree with you, and I agree with obviously with the research that's coming out, because I've seen it as well in the research that I've read and stuff like this, that need to belong definitely there. And that's one of the things that we drive home when people come in, is like, no, you're part of this now new family. And we literally go that far.
Well, it's really interesting to contrast what you describe about the sort of military experience with coming into some other kind of, a commercial organization. It may be more subtle, but it's still there. So if you think about that magical time between knowing you got the job and showing up on day one, the kind of stuff that goes through, I've asked people, thousands of people now, this question, what goes through your mind in that little window of time between getting the job and showing up on day one? The kind of stuff people worry about is, what time should I show up? What time is it okay to go home? What should I wear? Will they like me? Essentially, the questions are, will I fit into this group? And we have these evolutionary superpowers that allow us to identify the tiniest nuance of what earns belonging in a group. And we slowly but surely, if you turn up on your first day at 8:30 and halfway through the day you figure out that everybody else has been there since 8 o'clock, you're showing up at 8 o'clock on day two, right? We all do this. The military just does it very overtly, but every organization has these, written and unwritten, spoken and unspoken rules. And we human beings are incredibly finely attuned to it. So I often find it, I don't know whether amusing is the right word, but I often find it interesting that people say to me, oh, look, if I just hire more ethical people, I'll have a more ethical culture. Or if I just hire more creative people, I'll have a more innovative culture. And of course, what happens is that individual joins this system and tries to fit in. And one of two things will happen. If they're very, very different from the majority, either they will eventually go native, so they'll eventually adopt the behavior that is successful in the group in order to fit in and be accepted and belong, or they will leave, and they'll either leave through their own, their own decision that this isn't working, or they get kind of rejected by the immune system of the organization. So it's incredibly difficult to change your culture by recruiting, one by one. You can't change the system by adding one tiny little ingredient to it. The system will win every single time.
Yeah, you're talking to a guy that works for a beast of a system, right? And exactly what you said, people will leave based off of one of two ways. It's called voluntary release, and it's called dishonorable discharge. And that's one of the two ways you're going to get taught. You're going to leave the military. So, and you're right though. You can't just magically add someone in and expect the organization and the culture to change, because people, not individuals change an organization's culture. The organization as a whole needs to change, and it needs to be driven from the top start. So let's dive deeper into this. And how do we as leaders leverage the ideas of belonging to drive organizational change and culture, knowing that just hiring more, like you said, more ethical, which I kind of chuckled at, more ethical, or, let's go creative people, is going to drive a culture of creativity in an organization.
Yeah, the system will win, as you say. Look, the most important thing is to first notice. You can't choose if you don't first notice. You've got to notice what earns belonging in the place. You've got to then figure out whether the things that earn belonging are the things you want to see more of in order to successfully execute whatever strategy you have. And it doesn't matter what organization or what industry you're in. If you have a strategy without the culture to execute it, then you've just got a piece of paper. So notice first what earns belonging around here, then do the work to figure out, is that behavior what we actually need more of in order to execute this strategy? If no, then what behavior do we need to see more of to successfully execute this strategy? And then when you've identified that behavior, you then need to shift those underlying rules of belonging. Now, how do you do that? You do that by making sure that the new behavior that you're seeking is socially safer than the old behavior, which is a really easy thing to say and a really hard thing to do. So it's a simple idea, but it's not an easy one. So it's got to be safer to do the new than it was to do the old, socially safer.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So it's got to be socially safer, but one would think that the organization would just naturally go towards that because us as human beings, we like to be safe, we like to be cozy and warm, but I guess maybe that could be a part of the problem why we don't go towards that change. So why is it that we don't tend to go towards that already safer option?
Because safety, according to the human brain, is belonging. So if you're telling me on a poster or on a PowerPoint presentation to do behavior A, but behavior B is actually the thing that earns me belonging, I will do behavior B. I don't care what it says on your poster. I don't care what it says in your PowerPoint presentation. I'll do what actually earns me belonging in the real world. So making it true that the new behavior will earn me greater belonging than the old is the hard part to do. But firstly, you've got to figure out what that is so that you can then explain it to the leaders who they are the ones that need to be able to indicate what is going to earn belonging around here through their approval, through the way the whole group operates, their interpretation of behavior. It's got to be, that the new behavior is more positive than the old. As I say, easy to say, hard to do.
Right. So to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, so let's say I show up to a company, first week on the job, we'll use your analogy of, I show up at, let's say 9:30, and I notice everyone is there at 9. So I show up the next day at 9, and I walk around to see the company's, posters and minutes and all this stuff of, family's important, make sure your family time, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, oh, well, I got an issue. The reason why I show up at 9:30 day one is because of, school busing and kids and all this stuff, and say, hey boss, just so you know, I'm actually going to show up at 9:30. You're like, why? No. We start at 9. So that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Exactly right. So, or even if the boss says 9:30 is fine, but every time you turn up at 9:30, everyone in the room looks at you and, asks you if you brought the afternoon newspaper with you, or makes some kind of crack that makes it abundantly clear that you have lost some belonging by doing that behavior, then you're going to show up at 9 no matter what it says on that poster.
No, it makes absolute sense. All right, so obviously this is a problem point, and I would think if I was a senior leader of that company, that organization, and I'm trying to push this, family is important mentality, and take care of your family so that you can come to work and then take care of this family here type of ideology, and then you get out and you hear about these things, or you find out, or someone quits because of those reasons, like you said, just snickering, a little comments, which turns into a negative atmosphere, which then spins all kinds of other problems culturally as well. And I find this out as a senior leader, then, how do I go about fixing this? Because obviously I'm saying one thing, but the company's doing something else.
Right.
There's this disconnect.
Yeah. And look, the way to do it is to make it explicit. So bring it into the light. So have exactly that conversation that says we say family first, and yet every time somebody tries to do that, they're essentially shunned by the group. And we know that we have to change this. So we're going to call it out when we see that disconnect, and we're going to do it over and over and over and over again until the behavior that we want to see, in fact, is the behavior that is approved of around here. So that's where culture lives. It lives in the interpretation of behavior rather than the behavior itself. And look, let me just give you a little bit of an example to try and bring this to life a little bit. So I once worked in a company where it was completely normal for the most senior person in the room to leave the meeting before the end. And that was because in that particular culture, busy equaled important, And so every time they left the meeting before the end, everyone would sort of nod in, understanding. Yes, of course they have to leave early, busy, they're very important. In fact, if they stayed to the end, the people would kind of raise their eyebrows as if to say, don't you have somewhere that you have to rush off to? Like, aren't you one of the important ones? So when they did leave before the end, their status increased. Their belonging was improved. And I've worked in other companies where that identical behaviour, leave the meeting before the end, would have been interpreted as incredibly unprofessional. And clearly this is a person who doesn't respect the time of their colleagues, doesn't care about making next steps or accountabilities clear. And, after they left the room, everyone would just kind of frown and roll their eyes and go, wow, that's really, unfortunate. So identical behaviour, leave the meeting before the end, but interpreted completely differently by those two organisations. In one case, it earned belonging, in the other, it didn't. That is where culture lives, in the interpretation of behaviour. So the responses of other people to the behaviour, not in the behaviour itself. So if you see people sniggering when somebody comes at 9:30, that's the behaviour that you need to address, is the sniggering. To make sure that everyone understands that actually showing up at 9:30 to take care of your kids is something we think is really great around here. And it helps, of course, if the most senior leaders walk that talk. You will have heard that phrase before. If they drop off their kids at 9:30, that really helps because everyone kind of goes, well, we can't be sniggering too much if the boss is doing it.
It's like we almost need to start snickering at the snickering.
Exactly.
Like completely flip it right upside down. It's like, no. You're snickering at the person who's like, how dare you snicker at that person? And make them feel actually the one that is uncomfortable for being like that. And I like that.
Disapprove of the disapproval.
Yeah, 100%. And being an Army guy, I really like the overtness of it because we generally do well in that area. We have no issues with letting people know what we think when things aren't right. Sometimes do it to a fault, but definitely I like that. And it's funny that you mentioned the story of the two different companies and leaving meetings early, and how it was viewed. So I worked not for, but with another organization. So Army culture, you show up 5 minutes early. If you're not 5 minutes early, you're 10 minutes late. That is like literally a unwritten rule in military culture because it's just how we do business. So you always show up early, you show up prepared for a meeting and stuff like this. And another government organization I worked a lot with in one job, their organizational culture is that you showed up late to meetings. Why? For that exact same reason that you were talking about, that people leave early because, we're so busy. I don't have time to show up on time. So I don't know how many times I would be sitting there. I'm like, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. We're supposed to have this meeting. Where are they at? They're not here yet. And we, the Army guys were like sitting around, kind of chatting, doodling, whatever, waiting. And it's like 5 after 10, still nothing. 10 after 10, like, might as well start packing up. And then all of a sudden they did walk in, like, oh, so sorry, so busy, sit down. And we're like, that's a major faux pas to us. You showed up like 10 minutes late to a meeting. That's huge faux pas. But for them, that was actually daily life. And it's like,
and if you started working for that company, I reckon it would take you about a week before you started showing up 10 minutes late to meetings too.
I don't know. I'm going to hit 20 years of service this month. That's going to take a lot to drive out of me showing up late to a meeting. So let's talk a little bit harder. Let's talk a little bit deeper on the leader's role, because you mentioned it there a bit earlier, in the leader needing to lead by example, essentially. So what are some of the other ways that leaders can ensure that they're making this sense of belonging and they're driving these culture changes in their organization? Because ultimately we want to hit peak performance, hence the name podcast, peak performance leadership. We want to hit our organizations peak performance, drive our output up, make our teams achieve that peak performance state where everyone's firing on all cylinders. But these differences, these little cultural disconnects are definitely not going to help us get there. So what are some of the things the leaders out there can, either do or be cognizant of when they're trying to make these changes?
So I like to think of different types of conversations we have with our team as being either balcony conversations or dance floor conversations. So if we're down on the dance floor doing the doing, we're working in the team and doing the daily work. If we're having a balcony conversation, we're kind of looking down from above on the team. We're working on the team. So I encourage a lot more balcony conversations than we typically would do in a normal organization. And what I mean by that is when you have a team meeting, instead of diving into the how's everyone doing today and what's on our plate, the work in progress type dance floor meeting, I encourage leaders to have a how are we doing as a team conversation. So a working on the team conversation or a balcony conversation. And part of that conversation can be, hey, I want to work on our team culture. The first step in doing that is noticing what it is. So can we please, over the next couple of team meetings, start to make a list of what are the behaviors that earn belonging in this team and what are the behaviors that lose belonging? So you start to bring the unspoken into the spoken, things in the dark, bring them out into the light and examine them. And once you've done that, then you can start to evaluate as a group which of these behaviors are helping us and which are hindering us, and what do we want to change. Once you've identified what you want to change, then you can talk together about, okay, so the only way we're going to change this particular behavior is if doing it the new way earns greater belonging than doing it the old way. So what will we do as a group to make sure that we really overtly, and maybe in a kind of weird and clunky way at the beginning, congratulate or overtly approve of this new behavior when we see it. First, we've got to notice it happening, and then we've got to kind of be a bit over the top about, hey, that's great. I've just noticed you've done that thing. That's exactly what we want to see more of. Good for you. And so, what I've just described sounds like a relatively straightforward process. It's actually, it takes a lot of effort and time and really setting aside that balcony time to have those kind of on the team conversations instead of in the team conversations. So the leader just needs to make those times, make the space for those conversations to happen and lead that process.
Takes a very psychologically safe environment for people to speak up too, because essentially what you're saying is, let's have some tough conversations, folks, which depending on who you're talking to, i.e. in the level of the company, especially if a very deep company, that organization that I work for. So one of the things that I do, a couple of years ago, I commanded a squadron of 200 members. So I was in charge of them, essentially CEO, of a small, medium company. And I would go walk around every week, get in my office and walk around and talk to the people at the ground level. But you're talking about like me at the top, and then some of the guys, literally you could not go lower in the food chain per se, and having these one-on-one conversations with them. But in order to get these types of things out of them, you got to have that very psychological, safe environment where, one, they feel, safe and secure to open up, to let the boss know what they think, how they feel, et cetera, et cetera. Two, there's no fear of reprisal from, the person they're speaking to their supervisor, to their supervisor's supervisor, to their supervisor, et cetera, depending on how deep you want to go. So all these different things come to play. Like as you said, it sounds easy. It's one of those things that like brief spell, extremely hard to execute on. It takes a lot of dedication and a lot of deliberate planning and effort on behalf of the leader, but it's so crucial for sure.
Yeah, and look, what you're describing, I remember somebody once saying to me, the Queen thinks the world smells of paint. I reflected on that, right? Because every single place that she goes has just been repainted. And so when you're a senior leader, that power differential between you and your people is huge. And we often forget, I work with a lot of leaders and they say, but Fiona, I'm just me, why do they stop talking when I get in the lift? And I'm like, sorry, you're not just you. You're not one of the boys or the girls or the whoever. You just aren't. You carry your power with you everywhere you go. And so if you ask somebody 4 or 5 layers down in the organization what they think, the chances of them genuinely telling you what they really think are pretty much zero. The Queen thinks the world smells of paint. So you've got to find imaginative ways to get to the bottom of it. You talked about this idea of psychological safety. That is absolutely critical. But even with a very high degree of psychological safety, it would take an extremely brave person to say something, controversial to the boss's boss. So there are other ways of doing it. The walking around thing is not a bad thing to do. Obviously, it's great to be seen apart from anything else. But if you genuinely want to know what people think, you're probably going to have to put in place some other kind of mechanism. So a lot of people use focus groups, and they will, that's just a small group of people having a conversation, but often with an external, someone external to come in, or, occasionally you can kind of wheel in somebody from HR, although people are often very wary about talking, frankly, in front of them as well.
HR.
Yeah, I know, like those scary, scary people. Look, so, it isn't easy. It is simple, but it's definitely not easy. So understanding what people genuinely think. One of the things I find fascinating in my work is that I often work with senior leaders who tell me, don't worry, Fiona, we're measuring culture. We've got a staff engagement survey, an employee engagement survey. And I try to help them understand that the engagement survey will tell you whether a person likes the experience of the system they're in. It'll tell you about their experience of the system. It won't tell you what the system is. And it won't ask them ever to interpret behavior. So the kind of question you would love to be able to ask, if you can find the right person to ask it and, who will get a real answer. The question is, when Scott sacked Harry, why do you think Scott sacked Harry? Because if they think Scott sacked Harry because Scott didn't like Harry, then they probably think that's dreadful, and that's going to have a terrible impact on the culture. If, on the other hand, they think Scott sacked Harry because Harry was being unethical, they probably think that's fantastic, and that's going to have a really positive impact on the culture. So no engagement survey ever asks, why did you think the boss did that thing, and what do you think about that? Never asks their opinion of their interpretation of a behavior. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance to this, but trying to get a real conversation out of people is easier said than done, but definitely worth trying. And the more you do it, and the more you show that is safe, like genuinely safe, the more likely it is that people will be prepared to share what they genuinely think.
It's tough being alone as a leader. You're often in situations where you're not sure where to go. You're not sure what's the best decision. Yet, as Colin Powell once said, it's lonely at the top. And reality is, it takes time. Sure, you can read books and listen to podcasts such as this one, but nothing beats experience. But who has time for experience when you're at a situation right now that requires experience to lead yourself, your team, your organization through? That's where coaching comes in. You see, coaching enables you to unlock the experience in others. Right here, right now, you have 20 years of military service, plus 150 plus episodes of interviews and topics and research sitting at your disposal. So what are you waiting for? Are you ready to level up your game, to become that leader that you know you're meant to be? Are you ready to go to the next level? If so, drop me a line, scott@movingforwardleadership.com, or swing by the website and book a discovery call through movingforwardleadership.com/book. And let's get you moving in the right direction, leading better, leading more effectively today, right here, right now. Starting off with leading yourself. And then let's focus on how you can build your high-performing team to drive your organization's output higher, faster, harder today. Not next week, not next month, but today. All right, folks, that's it. Now let's get back to the show.
You've mentioned now interpretation a few times, and I meant to hit at it earlier, but you just reminded me by talking about it again. And interpretation is great and all, but it's so difficult because, everyone interprets something completely different. Right now we're on a video call, and to me, you have a reddish, raspberry type sweater on, jacket, whatever. I can't exactly see what type of shirt on, but it is, that type of shirt. I don't know. Maybe you see something totally different, different color. Maybe you're colorblind that I'm unaware of. And you know what I mean? So you get my point, is that, there's my interpretation, there's your interpretation, and then there's what actually happened, right? And then the old saying, there's three sides to the truth. So how do we balance that in an organization, that we're trying, especially when we're trying to do something so big as, one, making people feel belonged, and two, driving culture change, which is absolutely like one of the biggest things an organization can go through. Yet every single individual in that organization is going to interpret it in a completely different way.
Yeah. And we can't, people will respond to their interpretation. Regardless of what we do, they will always respond to their own interpretation of whatever has happened, always and forever, and there's nothing we can do about that. What we can, however, do is try to understand to some extent what that interpretation is. We can, of course, also, recognizing that belonging is the most basic of human needs, we can over-index on those symbolic things that help people feel like they belong. So I once joined an organization where I was told, it's great to have you here. We've ordered you a laptop. It should be here in about 3 weeks. And we've put in the requisition for your email address. That'll probably come about a week later. And your security pass, we're not quite sure what's happening to that. Could you just sit over there in that corner and, get on with it? So, little symbols, but important things that made me feel like I didn't belong at all. I've worked for another organization where on day one, they handed me my security pass, they handed me my laptop, everything was all set up. My first week of meetings was already scheduled. My boss introduced me to everybody, came to the beginning of every one of those meetings, explained who this person was that they had set up the meeting with, why they wanted me to meet them, what was important about their work and my work and the intersection between them, and then left us to get to know one another, and did that maybe 15 times during that first week. And boy, and by the end of the week, they held a morning tea for me, which I didn't even know was going to happen. And they gave me a giant bunch of flowers and a, fruit basket or whatever. Like by the end of that week, I felt like I had been a member of that family for years. So there are massive things that we can do as leaders to make our people feel like they belong. And that alone will go a huge way to making it likely that they will tell us the truth when we ask them how they feel about something, and that they will feel safe enough to share their real selves with everything else that happens down the road.
Love it. That onboarding process is so crucial, right? And that it really, in reality, is the first impression that your new employee has of your company. People say, oh, it's during an interview process, you make your first impression. Like, heck no. You're like wondering if you're going to dance at that point. And now you're actually, at the dance, and now you have your opportunity to have your true first impression with it. And that's something I'm currently trying to fix up a bit better in my current organization, because every summer we go through what we refer to as the APS, or active posting season, where people go out and people come in. So we get, whole team changes during the summer. So how do we make that process slick, smooth for the people that are coming in, so that they get integrated into their new unit, our new mission set, et cetera, be part of the team, the sub-teams, bigger, larger team, understand the culture of our organization, all these different things, and it starts right away at day one. At the same token, the other side of that coin is like, how do we probably say farewell to people? How do we exit them, and et cetera, et cetera. So I love that.
Yeah, beginnings and endings really matter. So I would imagine there's not a person listening to this who doesn't remember their first day at every job they've ever had, and probably their last day. So the brain is wired to disproportionately remember the end of something and interpret the whole experience through that end as well. So you're quite right. The start and the end are really crucial moments, and we as leaders should be paying a lot of attention to them.
Don't call it recency bias for nothing, right?
Right.
This has been a fantastic conversation. Absolutely loved it, but like all good things, we must slowly wrap up here. But before we wrap it up, I got a couple last questions for you. And the first being a question I asked all the guests here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. And as according to you, Fiona Robertson, what makes a great leader?
Self-awareness, courage, and humility.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Simple, but effective. And the final thing is, how can people find you? How can they follow you? It's all that you know. Shameless plugs. Have at it. So
okay.
Go ahead.
So I have a website, fionarobertson.com. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I welcome new connections and the opportunity to chat all things culture and leadership. I do a lot of keynote speaking and executive coaching and leadership development programs. And my book, Rules of Belonging, is available online via my website and all good online book retailers.
Awesome. And as always, for you, the listener, it's easy. Go to movingforwardleadership.com/181. The links are in the show notes. Fiona, thanks for coming out. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor, man, to have you here and discuss this super important topic.
Thanks, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. But you know what you could do to truly support the podcast? And no, that's not leaving a rating and review. It's simply helping a friend. And that is helping a friend by sharing this episode with them if you think this would resonate with them and help them elevate their performance level, whether that's within themselves, their teams, or their organization. So do that. Help me, help a friend, win-win all around. And hey, you look like a great friend at the same time. So just hit that little share button on your app, and then feel free to fire this episode to anyone that you feel would benefit from it. Finally, there's always more. There's always more lessons around being the highest performing leader that you can possibly be, whether that's for yourself, your team, or your organization. So why don't you subscribe? Subscribe to the show via movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. And until next time, lead, don't boss, and thanks for coming out. Take care now.